world that encounters numerous overwhelming advances in science. However, our civilization is constantly fighting against the same problems over and over. We're talking about terrorism, we're talking about violence, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about poverty. So, attending to this introduction, what is your definition of progress?
Well, this is a difficult question, of course, and being a scientist, I do not claim to have answers to many of the problems that you raised. One thing that I could note is the following. Many of the problems that humanity is facing, which in turn may be the causes for other problems, are problems such as fighting for resources, climate change, gaps in technology between different civilizations, and so on. Many of those can, if not be solved, can at least we can make progress in through education. In particular, through the appreciation of the role of science as part of culture and as a part of our lives. An example I like to give is most people would say that why should they care about Einstein's theory of special relativity or general relativity? Well, guess what? In the phone that each one of us now holds, this phone, we use a GPS system. The GPS system uses satellites that move far from Earth and move very fast. They need to use both special relativity and general relativity, and if they hadn't used that, we would be off in our GPS system by miles every day. So every person now uses Einstein's relativity without knowing it in their everyday lives. But it's more than that. Climate change, of course, is a huge problem which needs to be addressed by politicians. But the decisions they make have to be informed by science. So what we need is for everybody to realize that science is part of our culture that everyone should participate in. It doesn't mean that they should be scientists. Of course, not everybody should be a scientist. But if they are not scientists and they try to address a problem that requires input from science, they should have the right advisors, for example, that can provide that input.
So now you've mentioned about Einstein. I would like to ask you about your book, your brilliant blunders. Who is your biggest blunders out of all of the huge personalities that you mention in your book?
There is no biggest blunder. I mean, the 5 blunders I chose were made by 5 giant scientists, people like Charles Darwin, like Albert Einstein. I mean, these are, the luminaries of our world, yes? I wouldn't say that one blunder is bigger than the other in the sense that they are very different types of blunders. Einstein's case is a little bit interesting in that he thought that putting a certain term in his equations was a blunder, where in fact, if we look at it from today's perspective, his blunder, if he did any blunder at all, was to take that term out of his equation. So they are very different type of blunders, and it's very interesting that, number one, that even the biggest geniuses make blunders, but more importantly, that these things which I call brilliant blunders, which is not to be confused with sloppy blunders, these are blunders that are made because people try to think outside the box. They try to think not in the mainstream. They try to have really new ideas. And when you have new ideas, you sometimes make a blunder. Those are blunders we should encourage, you see, because those can lead to breakthroughs.
Now, if Einstein wouldn't have removed this acceleration premise out of his equation, our knowledge about science and the universe would have differed somehow?
No, if he hadn't removed it, this term from his equation, then he could have predicted that the expansion of our universe is accelerating, is speeding up, which we know today. We discovered this only in 1998. And otherwise, until 1998, we thought that the expansion of the universe is slowing down. Instead, it's speeding up, and he could have predicted it, but he didn't.
It's quite surprising. Now, why did you decide to look up to these mistakes of this huge scientist? Why did you try to pursue any kind of goal by taking up this brilliant blunder journey?
Yes, absolutely. My goal was, well, a small goal was to show that even if you are one of the greatest scientists ever, you may make a mistake. But the real goal was to show that blunders are part and parcel of the scientific progress. And not only scientific, in fact, actually, in every creative process, you have to encounter blunders. And the blunders I've chosen are these brilliant blunders, which means that you take people that try to think in unconventional ways. There is a lot to be said about incremental progress in very small steps. This is how usually science progresses. But every now and then, we need somebody to think in a completely new way that leads to something really new. And those sometimes turn out to be blunders, sometimes they turn out to be enormous discoveries. They are portals to discovery.
Now, you are a well-recognized astrophysic. I would like to ask you, what are the differences between math, physics, and even philosophy? Like, what are the limits and the boundaries among these three disciplines?
So they're really different. I mean, mathematics in itself has no immediate connection to reality. You can work in mathematics and make essentially no connection to the world around you. Astrophysics is an area which tries to explain the universe. We try to explain the universe and phenomena within it, from the way stars form, planets form, and so on, stars explode, how stars live, how galaxies form, how clusters of galaxies form, and how the universe is behaving as a whole. That's what astrophysics does. The tools that astrophysicists use to explain all these things is mathematics. So they use mathematical tools to explain all of that. Philosophy is very different in the sense that, okay, many hundreds of years ago, philosophers were also the scientists. Newton did science, but he was also a philosopher, and so on. Of course, all the great philosophers of the past, Plato was very interested in mathematics, but he was, perhaps the greatest philosopher to have ever lived. But those were times when we didn't still have what we now call the scientific method, which allows us to really make progress in science. So I see philosophy of today as more relevant or more important in things that are perhaps other than the sciences, in things like ethics, in things like understanding aesthetics, in things of that form of moral behavior. Because while we made enormous progress in science, I think our problems in moral behavior and ethics, we have the same problems or worse that we had at Plato's time. So I see the contribution of philosophers more in those areas. But of course, there is also logic, which is at the bottom of both mathematics and physics, and philosophers sometimes deal with that. There are people like Bertrand Russell, for example, who was both a mathematician and a philosopher. So there are those connections through logic.
And does the idea of God fit in this vast scientific knowledge that we have nowadays?
So it fits and it doesn't. I'll tell you in which way one can incorporate a belief in a deity. This is my personal opinion in today's science. So I have colleagues who are very religious people and who are scientists. And I actually talked to them. I said, how do you put together your religious beliefs with your science. And the ones that are really good scientists among them and very religious people, they answer almost always the same way. They say, look, I believe that everything behaves according to the laws of physics. And if I want to understand the universe, I should use the laws of physics. Where do I put the deity in all of this? Who determined what are the laws of physics? So that's where they introduce God. You know, that the laws of physics, everything is the laws of physics, but God determined. You know, one pope, 2 popes ago, said that he believed in Darwinian evolution because he said God is almighty. He or she or it could choose how they want things to happen, and they chose Darwinian evolution. So in that respect, there is no contradiction, yes, because these scientists behave like scientists in their everyday life, but they also have their beliefs. The place where science and religion clash is only when they are used improperly. When there are some people who try to introduce, for example, into science classes, creationism as if it's a scientific theory. Creationism is not a scientific theory. Scientific theory means that it is something that is falsifiable by the scientific method. You can do experiments to test it and falsify it. So if you want to teach the Bible, you can teach it in Bible classes. It has no room in science classes. That's where you don't, this serves in a bad way both religion and science when you try to combine them into saying things like, oh, this description in Genesis is exactly what modern physics says about so-and-so. That's nonsense. The description in Genesis was clearly written as a reaction of the awe that early people felt in terms of an inexplicable universe. It was not written as a scientific theory. Galileo already said this 400 years ago. And he said, look, not even all the names of the planets are mentioned in the scriptures. They were not written as a scientific theory. They were written, he said, for our salvation. You know, so that's the way you should understand it. There is science and there is religion, and as long as you keep this connection that, okay, maybe there is a God, that if you are completely non-religious, you say you don't need the God. There are laws of physics, and that's what they are, and that's it, you know, and so on. If you are religious, you can say, okay, but somebody decided about these laws, and so on. But don't try to say, the laws exactly correspond to so-and-so.
So it's better if they don't mix together?
Don't mix in this particular way, in this saying that what is written in the scriptures is a scientific theory.
Okay, now I would like to talk about curiosity.
Yes.
So we all know about your last recent book. And I would like to make an emphasis in our brain's reward system.
Yes.
And my question is, does curiosity triggers somehow this system in a similar way that drugs do, and therefore producing an addiction?
Yes, the answer is yes. A particular type of curiosity, yes. It turns out that curiosity, it has many kinds. So there is a curiosity that we feel when we see something that's very surprising. You know, something that we've never seen before. Kids in a village in Tibet suddenly see a white person that they have never seen before. So they are curious about this. That's perceptual curiosity, okay? That curiosity is a little bit like an unpleasant state. It creates a situation of deprivation, of a need. You need something to fulfill that, to feel okay again, because it doesn't agree with what you have seen so far. That's one type of curiosity. Then there is a curiosity that comes from our love of knowledge, the curiosity that drives all basic scientific research, where, and that triggers a mechanism in our brain that is an anticipation of reward. And that reward system, which gets triggered, is actually very adjacent to the reward system that is attached to
Drug consuming.
drugs or all kinds of addictions and so on. And indeed, curiosity can become some form of an addiction, in the sense that there are some people, scientists, let's say, who are so driven to answer the questions that they are pursuing that it becomes like an addiction. Or I know chess players who become addicted to chess. I mean, they can play chess from the morning till the evening.
And are you addicted to curiosity, Mario?
I am very, very curious. The thing is that I am curious about many things. I mean, there are people who are curious, very, very curious about one thing. I'm curious about many things. I'm curious about art. I'm curious about science. I'm curious about music. And I've been involved in these different things. So I'm not sure I would call myself addicted, because it's not the one thing. But maybe I'm addicted to curiosity in general, in that I'm curious about many things, yeah.
So Mario, we have finished our interview. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.